kind of like that, because that's, I think a lot of people do the second,
Yeah.
not the first. So Aaron Wignell is a CISSP, a CCSP, and spent the last 6 years as an IT risk analyst for Mountain America Credit Union. He evaluates projects, applications, and technologies for risk to the credit union and its members. Prior to that, he spent 5 years as an ITIS manager for a small software company. And with that,
Thank you. Appreciate it. For those of you that were here for Larry's, that was pretty intense, so I'll try to keep it light. I have lots of comics in my slides. So if you're familiar with XKCD comics, I'm a big fan. So hopefully I can keep you awake. And it'll be a little bit more light and not so intense. So I want to talk about IT risk. And there's your first comic. See, I promised comics. IT risk is not the sexiest thing about InfoSec. Everybody wants to be the hacker. Everybody wants to be in systems. I know that, but hopefully I can help you understand why it's necessary and the benefits it'll bring you. If you're in school right now, you probably hear risk-based security all the time, right? We practice risk-based security. But what does that really mean? If I ask you what your risk is today for your organization, could you tell me? Could you say this is my risk and this is why I know this is my risk? Or are you going to say, well, everybody gets hacked, so my risk is high? Hopefully we can get to a little bit more defined point with this. The reason we do risk-based security, hopefully we all know this, but just to reiterate, we want to put our resources in the highest risk areas. Wherever the risk is, that's where we want to spend our money, because our resources are not infinite. Whatever company, even if it's the government, you're still going to have a finite number of resources. So you want to put your resources where the highest risk is in order to get the most value out of it, right? So you don't want to be spending money guarding against being shot by a swimming dog carrying a handgun in his mouth, because that's probably not a high risk, right? So as you start a risk assessment, you start looking at your risk, you want to start looking at these questions. This is what you want to answer. You want to be able to say, first, what's my inherent risk? This is a fun exercise, actually. Try to think of something without any controls on it at all, because we oftentimes assume that there's controls in place. So let's imagine a CRM, a customer relationship management system. So you have this application that has your entire customer list in it. Now, if we want to talk about the inherent risk of that application, let's assume that there's no password, there's no unique user ID. It's being served over HTTP. It's not encrypted. There are no controls. There's no backups. You don't have a disaster recovery option. No controls whatsoever. So what is your risk? Well, it's high, right? Our risk is really bad in that case. And that's what we call the inherent risk. So that's the inherent risk of the system or the process. Now you want to measure that risk. How are you going to measure that risk? And we're going to get into that as we go on. So just keep in mind, you want to ask yourself, how am I measuring my risk? Now, to get to residual risk, let's talk about the controls that we have in place. The things like the password, the unique user ID, the role-based security permissions. It's being served over SSL, TLS. You know, obviously we don't do SSL anymore, but it's being served over TLS. We have a backup system. We have a disaster recovery option. These are the controls that we're putting into place, and those are mitigating our risks. So after we put all of our controls into place, we have some risk left over. There is absolutely no way to get rid of all risk. You can't do it, so don't try. There's going to be some risk that you're going to have to accept. And residual risk that's the amount of risk that you are willing to accept for that system or that process. Now, when we look at the controls, we want to think about, are these the right controls? Are they effective? Do we know that they're effective? Maybe we have too many controls. If you have your CRM, your customer relationship management system, and you take that and you stick it on an air-gapped computer inside a skiff that you built in your office, and only one person can go in at a time and they're video monitored the whole time, it's kind of overkill. Too many controls there. And if you're in the private industry, in business, you want to accept some risk. Some risk is good. If you're mitigating almost all of the risk, you're probably not going to be very successful. You do want to accept some risk. So I have a little exercise to lighten the mood and talk about controls. And I call it the Jurassic Park test. Now, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the original Jurassic Park, I'm going to ruin it. So I'm sorry. So, the original Jurassic Park, they had a problem. They have dinosaurs. They've created dinosaurs, real live dinosaurs. One of their problems that they want to control is they don't want breeding amongst the animals, right? Because then they're going to have too many animals to feed, too many animals to protect, too many animals to manage. So they need to keep the dinosaurs from breeding. One control that they put into place, since they're genetically engineering these animals, they decided, well, let's make them all female. They can't breed if they're all the same gender. So that's the control that they put into place. They also want to count them. So they design a computer system that counts them. And each animal has a radio tag, and that counts it on a regular basis, says, I caught all these animals, all their tags, they're still in the expected area, and we still have as many as we thought we had. So are these controls, are they operating as designed? So here's the spoiler. So the story goes that they had to fill in some gaps in the DNA, so they used amphibian DNA. And amphibians are known in populations where it is majority one gender, they'll actually switch gender. So this happens because they created this own problem for themselves. They engineered all female dinosaurs. So then they start some of them change into male dinosaurs. So then they start breeding. So clearly that control was not operating as designed. And are they effective? What are these controls effective? Well, if you've seen the movie, clearly not. The controls aren't working. We have eggs. We know that they're breeding. So the controls did not work. Why didn't they work? Well, maybe they didn't identify all the threats and vulnerabilities. Maybe they assumed that their controls were 100% effective. They assumed that the count of the dinosaurs would give them the total count, but because they didn't think they could breed, so they weren't expecting any more. So they're only testing for what they knew they had, and they weren't expecting more. Come back.
Not only that, but like if the dinosaurs aren't in their assigned spot,
Oh, the projector.
they couldn't do anything about it when the dinosaurs weren't in the place they were supposed to be.
Right. And if they don't know that they're out, they're not going to be able to get it. Okay, there we go. Thank you, sir. So they assumed that their controls were working. They weren't validated. And they were poorly designed. They made some assumptions that the dinosaurs wouldn't be able to breed. And so it was not the right control. So if you were in the last presentation with Larry, he did not go into threat, vulnerability, risk, and control. He wanted you to take his class. I'm going to go into it for you. So a threat is something that may or may not occur. It has a threat actor involved. Either somebody that wants to take you down because it's a hacktivist, politically motivated, or they want to get money. There's an actor behind it. A vulnerability is a weakness in the system. And then the risk is a combination. So the risk is a combination of a threat with a threat actor exploiting a vulnerability that leads to an impact to your business or your organization. If you have a data breach, that's an impact. But you can get there in a number of ways, right? You can get to a data breach by a phishing email. You could get it there because you have cross-site scripting vulnerability on your website. There's lots of different threats that lead to that risk. And that's why we have to specify the difference. The threat actor exploits the vulnerability to create an impact. And that's where your risk comes in. A control mitigates the threats and the vulnerabilities to reduce risk. And it can mitigate it in a variety of different ways. The control could help you avoid the risk. It could transfer the risk, like cyber insurance. You get cyber insurance, it's going to transfer your risk. A lot of people today have been talking about the malware, the ransomware on towns and cities. So some of these towns have gotten cyber insurance policies ahead of time. They were planning for it, and they used the payment from the insurance to pay the ransom to get their key back to release their data. So they've transferred the risk to the insurance company. So quick exercise, thinking back to the dinosaurs, to Jurassic Park. The amphibian DNA, threat, vulnerability, risk, or control? Vulnerability. It's a vulnerability. There's not a threat actor there. There's a weakness. The unisex population. This is a little tricky. It was a control. They designed it as a control, but it turned into a threat. And the threat actor is the animals themselves in this case. Yeah.
So how do you control an unknown unknown? Because at the time they developed the unisex thing, I wouldn't have even thought amphibian DNA that they could do that.
And that's the $1 million question, right? We have APT. You hear APT all the time, advanced persistent threat. It's something that you didn't know about.
So to answer that, something that I've heard a lot about at the Idaho National Labs recently was cyber-driven, consequence-driven
cyber-informed engineering.
Thanks. So the idea is you've got some unknown unknowns, but the consequence that you're looking at is the dinosaurs get out, right? The power grid goes down, the dinosaurs get out. The consequence, that's a terrible consequence. So you check your controls and you assess whether or not you've got enough, and then you add more engineering on top of it. So your unknown there, you don't have to know it. You know the consequence, which is the dinosaurs getting out, and you add controls to avoid that consequence.
Yeah.
To
mitigate it.
Where you try to apply it is on those unacceptable high consequence events. You're not going to be able to do it for everything, otherwise you're not going to automate. So rigorous prioritization, take those highest consequence events and engineer them like crazy.
Like you put it on an island in the middle of the sea. Don't bring it to Los Angeles, which is the whole topic of the second.
And you give them a lysine deficiency. So
Is it truly redundant? Is it truly resilient? And there's not, a tie there.
Right, and this relates to your $1 million question is because we don't have a good way to put a mathematical number on cyber risk.
it's very difficult.
Learning about
Yeah.
ways to get around.
So let's think about data itself. So for a lot of us now, data is the thing that we're protecting. And if data gets out, that's bad. There are so many different ways that data could get out. So many threats, so many vulnerabilities. So we always talk about encryption of data at rest. You want your data encrypted at rest so that if it does get out, it's going to be really hard to get to the actual data. So that's one control that you can put into place that helps you with the unknown. So if you have unknown vulnerabilities, unknown threats, encrypting the data hopefully just allows the bad guy to get encrypted data and they can't read it. And then you have, for virus detection, you have the heuristic behavioral type detection. So they're looking for certain behaviors that they see commonly amongst different malwares. And hopefully you catch those unknown ones with that. So unexpected death of an animal, in this case, would be a risk. John Hammond is building this theme park, and that animal he spent a lot of money on, that's an asset. Losing that asset is a big impact to him. And there's a lot of different ways that animal could die. It could die by disease, somebody could kill it, another animal could kill it. There's lots of different ways the animal could die, lots of different threats, lots of different vulnerabilities. But by losing that animal, he's lost his investment. So there's an impact. Uncontrolled population growth. I could argue vulnerability, and I could argue risk. That one's kind of tricky too, because let's say uncontrolled population growth within the park, they wouldn't be able to feed it, so there's an impact. They wouldn't be able to keep them contained. They wouldn't be able to provide medical care for all of them. So there's definitely impact there. But also, it's caused by the population growth. Expected population count. That was a control, right? They put that into place as a control. Wasn't perfect, but it helped. Loss of power to the electrified fences. Vulnerability. There's lots of threats that could possibly lead to the loss of power for the fence. That's a weakness of that control. There's a control to keep the dinosaurs penned, but there's a weakness. You can take out the electricity of it. Now, keep in mind that the absence of a control is not by itself a risk, a threat, or a vulnerability. It's just the absence of the control. So it's not a risk that you don't have password policy. It's just that you have more risk there than you're willing to accept. So you want to implement that control. And of course, XKCD has thought about this. We add in a new control where we activate the gene for extreme dwarfism, in which case it's easy to manage all the dinosaurs. Of course, that's not the control that they want to use. So back to risk-based security. How are you justifying to your boss your budget request? How do you, when you go to her and you say, I want X amount of dollars for what? Why do I want those dollars? We know layered security is good. We want more layers. It's the onion. Onions have layers. But if you go to your boss and say, I want $100,000 to put this extra layer of security on, and she says, why? We have 2 other layers. Why do we need to spend another $100,000? Are you going to use pew pew maps? I'm sorry for that. I don't know if you can translate that. A pew pew map. How many of you recognize this? A few people? Yeah. So this was a company a few years ago, Norse Corp. They wanted to sell security products. And so they came up with this this is just a still picture. It was actually animated, all those little lasers jumping across, and they have, looks like information down here of IP addresses and geographic locations. And they sold this as, this is what's going on out there. This is what you have to protect against. And they sent out press release to the news companies, to various news stations, and they all covered it, and it got a lot of popularity. And then some really smart people started looking at it, and they're like, you know what? This is based on absolutely nothing. It's just an animation. They went away really fast. Yes, theater security. I got too far away from my... So we want to talk about formalizing your risk assessment. First off, you want to determine your perspectives. There can be more than one perspective depending on resources. If you're in a big company like INL, they're going to be looking at a lot of different perspectives. If you're at a small software shop, you may not have resources to look at a lot of perspectives. But what I mean by that is we can look at just the CRM application as a perspective. Let's do a risk assessment of this application. So we're going to look at the technical controls around that. Or we could look at the entire sales process, from the leads that come in, the contacts that they make, that they record in the CRM system, and then when the customer then buys the product, they convert it from a lead to a customer record or something to that effect. You can do your perspective, the risk assessment can be for the whole process, not just the application. Or you could go, let's look at the risk of the accounting department. You could look at it from the entire department as a whole, or your entire organization. There's different levels that you can view and make a risk assessment. So depending on your resources, you'll have to make a decision on what do you want to see? What does your boss want to see? What's going to make the most sense for you? So we want to gather real data if we can. No pew-pew maps, no animated lasers. And you want to identify who owns that risk. And that's going to be different depending on your organization. It may be the executive management owns all the risk. It may be that each individual department owns the risk. But you as an organization have to decide who owns that. Who's the person that's going to say, okay, the residual risk is now at an acceptable level. And when we're talking about acceptable levels, we have a risk appetite and risk tolerance. So imagine, if you will, a 2-lane highway that has guardrails on both sides. So our risk appetite is we want the cars in their respective lanes driving on the freeway. That's our appetite. We can tolerate some deviance. There's going to be some deviance on that. Somebody looks down at the radio and they swerve a little bit. So we have a tolerance. The tolerance goes out to the guardrail. We can only tolerate so much deviance before we can't accept it anymore. So we have the appetite is where we want it to be. The tolerance is the deviation that we're willing to accept. And make sure your management supports your decision. Otherwise, it's going to not do you any good. And I usually do that by identifying what success looks like for the risk owner. So if it's a department, you say, what does risk look like to you for your department? Or if it's an application, whoever owns that application, what does success of this application look like? And then identify what may inhibit the risk owner from achieving that success. If the CRM, if you put too many controls into the CRM and they're not able to get to their lead data fast enough to move at their pace, that may not be acceptable to them. If you stick it on a really old box with no resources, not enough RAM, not enough processing, that's going to impede their view of success. So, some real data, and this is not by any means like a canon of data. This is from a report from IBM and Ponemon Institute. And when I originally made this slide, I used the 2018 data, and I've updated it for the 2019. But the way that they've analyzed it, they've tried to look at all the costs of what you incur for a data breach. If we add up all of that cost, what is it going to cost you? So average over globally for a breach less than 1 million records is $3.92 million. And the 2018 data was 3.86, so it has gone up a little bit. And it comes out to a per record cost of about $150 per record. Now, the reason that I have under 1 million records is that they've divided it into mega breaches and regular breaches, because what they found is that mega breaches with a lot of records have exponential costs. So the average global cost of a data breach with 1 to 50 million records, 42 million. It's a lot higher. The cost has gone up a lot. And the US tends to be higher on average. It's a number of reasons. One, like what we have to pay to recover, like if we're paying a company to come in and investigate, it's more expensive. You'd have to read the report. I don't remember all the details, but it's a good question. Some other things that came out of that, though, is this cost is realized over about 4 years. 53% is realized in the first year, 32% in the second year, and then 16% the next 2 years. Yeah.
Really high numbers. So
Yeah.
for like smaller businesses, like how could you know, still make a profit, invest in the necessary amount of like security to prevent something like that? And if you accept any risk that may lead to that, like you're done.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge. So if you're in a smaller business, you may want to try to find other businesses that had a breach that are about the same size and see what their cost was. See if you can find, it's kind of like real estate comps, you know. You see how much the house next to you costs to see what your house is priced at. Obviously, this report is geared towards a little bit bigger organizations. So yeah, if you have a very small business, it's going to be a smaller cost, but it could still go past your profit and just completely wipe you out.
Yeah, it just sounds like you basically just have to have a prayer that you're not hit.
A little,
Does insurance cover damages?
yes. You can get a data breach policy, and you have to determine if you can afford the premiums.
So one of the problems that we see now is that data breach insurance is so immature that the consumers don't really understand the policies. There are a lot of caveats, so you may buy insurance, but then not realize that you are bound to do certain types of, common practices or best practices. And if they can find one of those practices that's not been done, then they won't pay.
Yep. The insurance policies expect you to have a certain amount of due diligence. And if they feel like there were some controls that you didn't put in place that you really should have, they may deny paying. I also read an interesting article this week. And I talked to our insurance administrator, and he's had the same conversation with our insurance broker. And that's that the availability of those insurance policies is also making it more likely that organizations will buy it so that they can pay their ransomware ransom. So it's a little bit cyclical, and the insurance companies are getting a little leery of that. It is a very young thing, cyber insurance policies. And one thing that they take into account in this is they assign a cost to irregular customer turnover. So we saw, if you remember, when we watched Target and Equifax, their stock dips for like 2 days, and then it starts coming back up. The stock price rebounds pretty quickly. But what they quantify is if you have customers that you've been maintaining for a long time and suddenly you have a bunch of customer turnover that's abnormal, you're going to incur additional costs in order to do that, whether it's marketing to bring in additional customers for the ones that lost or PR type of stuff. They're counting a cost for abnormal customer rotation. So you didn't think you're going to have to do math today, I know, but I'm going to make you do a little bit of math. And this is very basic. This is not canon by any means for any one organization. But for our inherent risk, we can generally say that the impact times the likelihood is what our inherent risk is. If we divide that by the mitigation, then we get to our residual risk. So here's an example. I use the data breach numbers from the IBM Ponemon report. So it's a $3.92 million is what we expect to pay for a data breach for under 1 million records. Now, I put a likelihood as 4 just to keep it simple, but the way I come up with this is, you have a phishing program, right? You're looking at phishing emails coming in, and a lot of them are pretty bad, and most people don't click on them. But so just for example's sake, we'll say 4 times in the year you get a phishing email that comes in that is just really good, and you have a lot of confidence that somebody is going to fall for it. Somebody's going to click it. So there's 4 times in a year that you know you're going to get that phishing email that someone will fall for. So if we do the math, we're now looking at an inherent risk. So before our controls, our inherent risk is 15.68 million. And this little note at the bottom, from the 2018 report, they projected that that would grow by 6.7%. It didn't quite grow as much as they expected. I thought that was kind of interesting. So now let's mitigate it. This 1.23 million mitigation comes from the report. They found that a company that puts together an incident response team and tests it regularly can reduce their overall cost of data breach by 1.23 million. So those companies that put in an incident response team and tested it regularly mitigated that cost by 1.23 million. So we do the math, and now we're at 12.75 million as our residual risk. Obviously, we're going to have other controls to factor. We have other mitigating controls that we're putting into place. So that's only for one control, the incident response team. So it's gonna come down from that. But the reason we do this calculation is because you may not have this risk happen. You may not have a breach in a year, 1 year. Yeah.
So is that 1.23 million is that like a net cost? So the cost of the CERT or response team?
That's the amount that it reduced their overall cost for responding to the breach.
Point blank, or does it take into account how much it costs to put in the team? Because if they say,
Yeah, it's an average. So they ask all these companies that had a data breach, and they say, how much did it cost you for all these things? And they averaged it out. So we do this calculation because in one particular year, you may not have a data breach, right? We're saying you have a risk of 12.75 million, but that doesn't mean you're going to have a data breach. You may go 5 years without a data breach. You may go 10 years without a data breach, or you might have 2 or 3 in the same year. We have to come up with a number that's kind of takes all of that into account, because it's not exactly just dividing it by 4 or anything like that. So, yes.
So is that the number you would take to upper management and be like, hey, this is our risk, give me money so I can.
Yes. Yes. Once you get all of your mitigating controls in there. So because the only control we considered there was the incident response team.
So that'd be what's current with the controls you already have in place.
Yeah. So
Say, can I have money
here's our residual
reduce
risk.
it by X amount more?
Yes. Yes, sir.
So I think it's important to recognize how deep and broad that is, because the value, what you spend is not necessarily proportional to the quality.
Correct.
Of the control, right?
Correct. Which is why we do risk-based security. We want to make sure we're putting our money at the highest risk area. We're putting our resources there, because you're not going to be able to cover every threat and every vulnerability, because you don't have an endless pile of money. So yeah, there is somewhat of a flaw there. So as you're, how am I on time?
5 minutes.
Okay. So threat modeling, I'm not going to go deeply into threat modeling, but so we talked about a threat is there may be multiple threats per risk. There may be multiple threats, multiple vulnerabilities that lead to a risk. Oftentimes our controls are mitigating specific threats, whether it's a control that validates the input on the fields of your web form to make sure that you don't have SQL injection problems. That control is only mitigating that one threat. It's not mitigating somebody walking into your data center and taking the data. It's only mitigating the threat of invalidated input. So we have to kind of do a threat model. Let's make a map of as many threats as we can. And there are some tools out there, which we'll talk about in a second. But if it's even as simple as a threat attack tree, so you get in Visio and you list out all the different attacks that you can think of that lead to one particular risk. How all these threats could lead to a data breach. You can create it essentially becomes a library of threats that apply to that particular system. Because we know that phishing, business email compromise, zero-day insider threat, vendor third-party, unpatched systems, Those are all different threats. And I just quickly, does anybody remember the target breach and what caused it? HVAC. So the HVAC system is being controlled remotely, and there's a connection, internet connection that they can use, obviously, because they're controlling remotely. And there was no separation between the HVAC system and the point of sale system. So it was the HVAC vendor that was compromised, not Target. So is that in your threat model? What are you looking at your vendors? Are you evaluating your vendors? Are you asking for security controls from your vendors? And this is just a fun one. I'm from Salt Lake, and if I go swimming in the Great Salt Lake, that's not in my threat model. There are no sharks in the Great Salt Lake. The salinity is way too high. They've tried. They put a shark in it. The salinity is so high it kills the shark. So that's not in my threat model. I pulled up this from devops.com, which is a good resource for a lot of this stuff. This is the steps in threat modeling. Identifying your assets. You got to know your assets. If you're going to protect something, you got to know what you're protecting. Describe architecture, decompose the application, identify threats, document threats, rate threats. And so there's different threat models. Stride is what Microsoft uses. Pasta, Trike, Vast, Octave, these are all kind of different threat models. Microsoft has a free tool called the threat modeling tool. It's very developer centric. So it's almost like you create a Visio diagram of the system and you bring in, okay, I have an IIS system of this version and I stick it in, and then it pulls from the library all the known threats and vulnerabilities that they know of. It pulls out of that library. It's very noisy, but it's effective. Somebody had a question?
Well, I was thinking there's kind of something online that there's like a website where you can go and like look up certain kinds of, you can look up a type of product that someone uses. You can look up if there's any vulnerabilities within that product, is that kind of like the system?
Well, so some of the GHS stuff.
Yeah, like CVE. Yeah, that would be that would be a lot of vulnerabilities. So you use that to pull in vulnerabilities into your threat model. Sure. Vast. I've been looking at Vast. There's it's called Threat Modeler. There's an application that goes with it, and you can join it up with your Jira and various other applications. So that's kind of interesting. But you'll have to research that because I can't get into them. And last XKCD comment for you. If they steal your laptop and you're logged in, they can read your email, take your money, and impersonate you to friends, but at least they can't install drivers. Yes.
Any last questions?
How would you put a timeline on mitigating certain types of risk? Like, let's say, you've done your scan barriers in place, like, I know that these computers, need this patch, this computers need this patch. What is an effective way to put a timeline on how to get done? Because obviously you just can't install every single patch a day and not have any problems.
That's where your acceptable risk and your risk tolerance comes in. So you have a.
That's where consultants like to say it depends.
Yes. Excellent.
This requires some stuff.
Yes. So you've got to decide how much risk are you exposed to. If you haven't installed the Bluekeep patch, for example, and you have systems there, you're running short on time. So that's something you probably need to do first. So you got to decide how much risk you're willing to accept. And a different company is going to be different. One company may say, as long as we patch within 30 days, we feel good. Another company may say 2 weeks. It just depends on what you're protecting and what your appetite and tolerance for risk is.
And so it's how can you communicate that to management? Maybe there are some other mitigations that could be less expensive, although not as effective. That can be an interim measure until you go forward. Maybe you can change the way you do operations so that your critical data or processes aren't at risk because of that. But at the bottom, it's all about
Yeah.
risk.
You have
Last question.
Yes, sir.
It's kind of, as upper management, how would you want someone to convey to you, like, I'm just saying, hey, we're screwed unless I get.
Okay, it was an old movie. It was an old movie based on an old movie. the old movie was called The Wizard of Oz, and the newer movie was called The Wiz. And the Wicked Witch of the West had a song called "Don't Bring Me No Bad." So, so that's exactly what I want to hear. But of course, that's not it. And what you want is something that's fact-based, right? And you want to know, and so if you haven't hired good people, right, and then like you don't get a good report, right, or you don't trust them, then as a management, it's your own fault. So you have to make sure that you have an appropriate staff with the tools to be able to go and come back and give you those recommendations. And then
Yeah.
you work with.
Yeah, I didn't get to it, but you want to make a pretty but succinct report. If you were here for Larry's presentation before, he talked about reports like that. You can only remember what was it, 5 plus or minus 2 facts. So if you put too much in the report, they're not going to read it.
So with that, I'd like to thank
Thank you.
And I believe we're on a break until 3:30, and then we'll convene here for the last interview. After that presentation, we're going to be holding kind of hot wash. We want everyone to come and talk to us about what worked well, what could work better, what are some recommendations for next year. The volunteer team is going to be doing that, and then we'll say goodbye and hope to see some people at the party that's going to be later on. So